All right, so for this set of notes, we're talking about human fertility rates, which is measured in a metric that we talked a little bit about while you were watching the Hans Rosling Don't Panic documentary. It's called total fertility rate. So total fertility rate is the average number of children that a female in a population will bear during their life, during their childbearing ages. It's measured in number of births per woman, and you'll see decimal points on those numbers because it is an average. Obviously, a woman is not having 2.1 children in their life, but some of them may have two, some of them may have one. About demography, it's measured in births per woman in terms of assigned female at birth. Just recognize that there is distinction between gender identity and sex and childbearing ability, even within people who were assigned female at birth. There is a wide spectrum of fertility as a metric for those people anyway. So it's kind of a simplified term that we're using here, but I just wanted to make a side note about that. So total fertility rate is number of births per woman, and when we're looking at the total, it's the average for that population. For this metric, there is a level called the replacement fertility level, which is the number for total fertility rate that would be required for this population to remain stable, for the number of children to just replace their parents. You'll notice that the total fertility rate in developed nations is 2.1, which is more than the two parents that birthed those children. That is because there is some level of total of infant or child mortality, so some people don't make it past that initial stage. It's relatively low in developed nations, but it does still happen. And so that total fertility rate being above 2, that's why. The other reason is because some people just don't have children. So you may have 3 kids, but if one of those does not go on to have their own children, that 2.1 accounts for that possibility as well. If we're looking for the total fertility rate, or the replacement fertility level for developing countries or less developed countries, that is going to be slightly higher than developed nations. The reason for that is because of infant and child mortality being higher. So that attrition rate, for lack of a better term, that loss of life in those early stages is going to be higher, and so more births are had in order to end up with a stable population. Infant mortality rate is a technical demography term, which means the number of deaths of children under the age of 1 per 1,000 people in a population. It's just like crude birth rate, crude death rate is per 1,000, because demographers are just the worst and they can't do it in percents. But it's the number of deaths of children before they reach the age of 1 per 1,000 people in a population per year. This is going to be higher in less developed nations because of lack of access to healthcare, because of lack of access to clean water, because of lack of access to adequate nutrition. And so if you have that higher infant mortality rate, you end up with a higher total fertility rate, not because it's like, well, just have some replacements, but because there is this expectation of higher rates of losing some of those children. And so if you have a family, especially in earlier stages of the demographic transition, which we'll talk about later this week, a lot of times children are involved in running family operations, and so having sufficient children in your family is crucial for family function. And so when we're looking at total fertility rate and the replacement fertility level, those numbers down at the bottom are the replacement fertility levels. For a stable population, if your total fertility rate is 2.1 and you're a developed nation, that is stable. Your population is not growing. If it's greater than that, you are growing, and if it's less, then that is a declining or shrinking population. There is a very distinct link between infant mortality rate and fertility rate. So these two graphs are showing the same timeline of 1961 to 2020 or 2021. And so when we're looking at these two, I'm wrong. It's not 1990. 1960. I thought it was. So over on the left, I grabbed the wrong graph, but it goes from 1990 to 2021. That is a pretty substantial difference over that time period. We're looking at a much lower infant mortality rate just within the last 30 years, going from about 65 infants that were under the age of 1 that died per 1,000 live births down to less than half of that, somewhere between 25 and 30, like 28-ish it looks like. In that same time period, you see a reflection of that in your fertility rates. Less children are dying, which is a really good thing. That is correlated with the lower fertility rates in children per woman in the global average. There's also, this is a fascinating topic, drawing correlations between different metrics of a population, especially within Human Development Index, which we'll talk about in a sec, but basically quality of life and total fertility rates. Per capita income is one of those metrics that we can draw correlations between that and fertility rates. When we're looking at this graph, to me, it's a pretty clear correlation here, where the higher the GDP is, the lower the total fertility rates is, the lower the births per woman are. You can also see a lot of patterns in those geographic regions of where you see lower GDP, where you see higher births per woman. There are some interesting outliers, which I would be happy to talk to you guys about if you have specific questions, but a lot of the time those come down to societal differences, religious differences, cultural differences. And then there are the GDP differences that are interesting too, where you have Haiti down here, whereas most of North America is substantially higher than that. So you have a lot of inequity in these areas of the world, both in terms of GDP as well as in fertility rates. So as GDP per capita increases, children per woman, or total fertility rate is the other way of saying that, decreases. There's a lot of reasons for that. We'll talk about some of those with the demographic transition section that we'll cover next. But there are a lot of reasons for that, mostly from that same infant mortality rate issue that we talked about on the previous slide, but also because of societal changes that happen as nations gain income. If we're looking at how that impacts the world's population, in the green here we have the world population, just number of people in the world. Up until 2023, those are actual numbers, and then past that it's a projection of where the UN thinks the world population growth is going to end up. You'll notice that the growth rate, so the percentage increase or decrease of the population, has a huge spike. That is going hand in hand with the spike in population. There were some dips and changes around World War II, after World War II, and those are correlated with this big spike, but then it starts to go down. We start to see a decrease in the growth rate. However, it is still above zero. So even though it looks like the population is shrinking, when you just look at growth rates, as long as that number is above zero, your population size is still growing. If it's a 0.01% growth rate, that is more than zero, you are adding some number of people to this population, even if it's a small number. It is important to note that there is a negative number on this graph for growth rate. It is now looking like we may end up with our world population shrinking. There's a number of reasons for that we'll talk about as well later this week. But it doesn't look like expansive growth is necessarily the biggest concern at this point. It may be that the population will shrink and age in such a way that it is problematic to maintaining our economic systems, our health systems, our social systems, where it's not just unchecked growth at this point. We are reaching logistic growth and starting to look like it's going to decline. That has a lot of implications that we'll talk more about. This graph is looking at both the population size, so up on the top here, this is population size of the entire world. There's different projections by the UN, by other institutions that measure these kinds of demographic data, but it depends on who you ask what that population size, what this projection side of the graph will look like. That comes down to a lot of things: environmental concerns, societal changes, economic concerns. All of those will play into the changes in the human population size over time. But what is generally agreed upon is where that population growth will continue, where those people are being added to our global populations, and that is largely sub-Saharan Africa. They're earlier on in the demographic transition, meaning that they are still developing as nations. They're still going through a lot of societal and economic changes and still have really high growth rates. And so most of the people who are being added in sub-Saharan Africa. Right now, we think of India and China as like the giant population centers because they are, but those are going to become less of the the growth areas of the world than sub-Saharan Africa, and they'll start to actually decline a little bit as they reach the later stages of demographic transition. And so this is another way of looking at that, possibly a kind of confusing way of looking at that, but what this is looking at is the amount of people, like what portion of the global population is made up in each of these nations. So right now, or in 2017, I should say, China had 1.4 billion, but if we project forward to 2100, that population is about half the size. So this is what it looks like now, but that doesn't mean that that's what the world population will look like in composition in the future. So when we're planning for human growth and when we're planning for this population change, we need to be strategic with our infrastructure development, with our economic development, and how we help make this transition to a future world most sustainable and most beneficial for human well-being and environmental well-being. But these people are being added to the population, and they have a reasonable expectation of having a good life after they're added to this population. There is some serious division in the world in terms of economy. This we'll talk about more with the development or the demographic transition, but it's important to note that while the population of the world is distributed in this way, that doesn't mean that that's how the money is distributed in the world. So we have vast economic disparity in the world, where the high-income countries that only have like 15-ish% of the world's population hold more than 80% of the world's wealth, whereas the lower income developing countries or less developed countries, lower or earlier on in the demographic transition, they have way more of the population, but only 3% of the wealth. So that disparity is a difference in per capita income of 63 to 1. Huge economic divisions. This is another way of looking at that. I'm going to skip past this and we'll talk about this with the demographic transition on Friday. But when we're looking at this population growth and how total fertility rates change and how the quality of life changes after somebody is born and added to this population, there are specific indicators of development that are defined by the United Nations that go into what's called the Human Development Index. Those things are metrics like your life expectancy. So when you're born, you have the expectation of continuing this process of living, and how long you can do that is an indication of development. More developed nations are going to have a longer life expectancy because of access to adequate nutrition, clean water, healthcare, all of the things that we expect in our developed nation in order to help keep us healthy and living a long time. But other indications of development and Human Development Index, quality of life essentially, are things like access to education. And we can measure that through things like adult literacy rates, which we looked at earlier this week. And they are actually pretty high globally. There are some disparities, but it's pretty high right now. Educational attainment, meaning how long is somebody going to school? Can they go to school for a long period of time? And then there are a lot of standard of living indicators like per capita GDP. How much money do you make as a person? Individual purchasing power. With that money, what can you do with it? Do you have access to clean water? Do you have access to healthcare? Access to food? And child food access is a much more important indicator of development because of the implications for life expectancy, because of the implications for how does this nation care for the most vulnerable, the least powerful of its population. Gender equality is another really big one that has a huge impact on total fertility rate, which we'll talk about in a sec. But all of these play into this number, this Human Development Index. The higher that number is, the more developed that nation is. So when we talk about developing nations, developed nations, this is what that number is indicated by. So looking at where that lies in 2021, this is a map that shows the Human Development Index as measured by those metrics by the UN. For most of the northern hemisphere, or well, I should say for most of North America, for Canada and the United States, really, and then for some of South America, for most of Europe, Russia, for areas that we think of as developed, they are numerically. There are some that are on the rise, like China is rising, and it's important to note these scales here. When we're looking at a high versus a very high, the color looks really different, but that number could be a 0.001 difference. So it's important to recognize limitations of graphics of maps. But we're looking at some areas that have some significant disparity, that have some significant room for growth, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, in those areas that are going to be the centers of human population growth. So if we're going to be adding people in these areas, it's important that those areas also get attention for development and for growth in these kinds of metrics. If we're looking at doubling times, the lower the total fertility rate, the longer it's going to take to double. This makes sense because fewer people are being added. If you have a total fertility rate of the world in 2.6, which was the average, that's a 58-year doubling time for the global population. But when we look at how that breaks down between developing and developed countries on that map, most of that growth is happening in developing nations, and developed countries are really low. It's going to take a very long time to double, and actually a lot of them are on the declining side. So it would end up being estimated halving time if you're in a negative growth rate, which is a whole other thing. So developed countries, populations are usually constricting at this point. For the most part, developing countries still expanding. So we have a very distinct change in our population dynamics as a result of that. In terms of that kind of growth and emphasis on development in these nations that are currently lower on the Human Development Index, there are 4 themes that were agreed upon at this International Conference on Population and Development, and those are the ones below. Both the developed and developing countries agree that we need to figure out a sustainable, managed way of reducing poverty, promoting economic development during population growth. We need to focus on women's rights to healthcare, education, and employment. All of those are linked very closely with declines in population growth rates and in quality of life. And that's not just like because women have it better. Increasing women's rights increases rights for a population, and I'll talk about that in a sec. Development should not be happening without reducing poverty. If you are developing a country, you need to be developing the entire group of people. Existing poverty in developing countries is an affront to human dignity. These are the points that this conference attendees kind of agreed upon and solidified as a group. So these are not my words, these are International Conference on Population Development. I agree with that, but I just wanted to make it clear that this is not a soapbox that I have created. Existing poverty in developing countries is an affront to human dignity and should not be tolerated. If you have a life, that life should be of quality. It should be worth living. It should be something that you don't hate every day of. And I feel that very strongly no matter who you are. Both poverty and development are a threat to the environment, and only sustainable development can prevent biological and human impoverishment. So when we're doing this development, it can't just be at the expense of the environment. We have to do it strategically and sustainably. When we're looking at those metrics, literacy rate, like I said earlier this week, is really high. On average in the world, it's like 86%. But when we break that down between men and women, it starts to fall apart a little bit. We start to see some disparities here. So adult men have a higher literacy rate. It's an average of 90% or so across the world. There are areas that could use some substantial help. Again, in that Human Development Index map that we saw earlier, it's the same areas. Literacy rates are lower in sub-Saharan Africa. They're lower in some of the areas in the Middle East and the Indian subcontinent. I can't think of what you call that part. Southern parts of Asia. But for adult women, it's lower. In those same areas, you'll, in general, almost across the board, see lower literacy rates in those areas. They were lower for men than the global average, but they're much lower for women. So if we're trying to focus our development, it's important to note these areas of disparity between adult female literacy and adult male literacy. I don't really like this graph, they made these maps 2 different colors from the same data source because it makes it hard to compare. So when you're making maps, if you're ever in that position, use the same scales and the same colors so that people can compare them easily. But if you parse through these, you'll see that these areas that are circled are areas where male and female literacy are distinctly different, and that is an area of concern. the reason it's an area for concern is there is a very distinct link between education opportunities for women and total fertility rate. As education increases, total fertility rate decreases. And it's not that without education they don't realize that, oh, I shouldn't have so many babies. It's more about opportunities and agency, individual agency. So if you have access to education as a female, typically that goes hand in hand with access to employment, ability to do things besides just being a stay-at-home mom, which if that's what you want to do, wonderful, do that thing. But having those choices is what makes this difference. Having those societal structures in place that allows for individual freedoms. We can see that with this gender inequality index, which again is a UN metric that looks at reproductive health options, political representation, educational opportunities, and labor force equality. As gender inequality increases, so does total fertility rate. If women don't have individual agency or have less individual agency, they have less control over their bodies and their choices and the number of offspring that they have. So we, as the United States, are this blue dot right here. That is not the highest on gender inequality, or not the lowest, I should say. It's neither. But I would love it if all of us could get lower down on this gender inequality index so that men and women were treated equally, or equitably at least. And so the fertility rates being lower, again, it's not because women are getting smarter in these situations. It's because they have options and individual agency and choice. If we focus on this gender inequality, you have more qualified people in the workforce solving more problems, working together from different perspectives, different backgrounds, and that's better for everyone. Unfortunately, our progress in reducing gender inequality in the world has been relatively slow. Women are only about 35% of global labor incomes. That's not to say global workers, but income. So of the people making money, only 35% of that money is going to females. Yes, there are societal differences in the roles that women and men inhabit in the workforce, which is important to acknowledge, but in the same roles there is still pay gap and wage inequality. Okay, so that is my semi-rant on total fertility rate and gender inequality and what we need to do in order to make the world a better place. We'll talk more about demographic transition on Friday, talk more about the points made in this, and if you have questions and thoughts and things you want to discuss, we'll do that on Friday. See you soon. Bye.